There is a sacred silence to being home alone at night. It's a feeling of absolute sanctuary, a silent contract we make with the world. We lock our doors, draw our curtains, and believe we have created a bubble of safety, an impenetrable fortress against the vast, indifferent darkness outside. But the most terrifying moments in life are the ones that break that contract. It starts with a sound that doesn't belong. A floorboard creaking on the porch when no one should be there. A whisper carried on the wind that sounds almost like your name. In that instant, your sanctuary becomes a cage. Every window becomes a vulnerable eye. Every door, a fragile barrier. The silence is no longer peaceful. It's filled with dreadful anticipation. Tonight, we are exploring 3 true terrifying stories from people who heard that sound. People who looked outside and found something waiting for them in the dark, shattering their sense of safety forever. These are stories that remind us that the most terrifying barrier in the world is a thin pane of glass. Our first story comes from a woman named Maria, who lived in a quiet, idyllic cul-de-sac in suburban Ohio. Her house was her pride and joy, particularly the large picture window in her living room that overlooked her perfectly manicured front lawn. For years, that window was a source of light and comfort, until the night it became a source of pure terror. It began on a Tuesday. Maria was washing dishes after dinner, glancing out the window as the sun set. She noticed a man standing across the street on the edge of her neighbor's property. He was tall, dressed in simple dark clothing, and he was perfectly still. He was looking directly at her house. She found it odd, but dismissed it. Maybe he was waiting for someone. The next night, he was there again. Same time, same spot, same dark clothes, same silent, unmoving stare aimed directly at her home. This time, a cold knot of anxiety formed in her stomach. This wasn't a coincidence. She turned off her lights and watched him from the darkness of her living room. He didn't move for nearly an hour before turning and walking away into the night. The third night, she called the police. As she spoke to the dispatcher, her eyes fixed on the man, he seemed to sense it. Before the patrol car could even arrive, he calmly turned and vanished. When the police came, they found no one. With no crime committed, all they could do was promise to keep an eye on the area. This cycle of terror continued for 2 weeks. Nearly every night, the silent sentinel would appear. Sometimes he would be there for minutes, sometimes for hours. Maria's life became a prison of fear. She stopped turning on her lights at night. She kept her curtains drawn tight. The feeling of being constantly watched, of her home being under siege by this silent, unknown entity, was psychologically devastating. Then, on the 15th night, the rules changed. She peeked through a tiny gap in her curtains. He wasn't across the street anymore. The ominous drone intensifies. A faint, high-pitched, tense sound layers on top. He was on her lawn. He stood halfway between the street and her house, his form a dark statue in the moonlight. He had crossed a boundary. Maria scrambled for her phone, her hands shaking too violently to dial 911 properly. As she fumbled with the screen, she risked one more look. He was no longer on the lawn. He was at her picture window. His face was just inches from the glass, his features obscured by the darkness. His breath was fogging up a small circle on the pane. He wasn't trying to get in. He wasn't making a sound. He was just looking, observing her in her own private sanctuary. The thin pane of glass felt as fragile as a soap bubble. That was the image that broke her. Her scream was silent, trapped in her throat. She finally managed to call the police, who arrived in minutes. But just like every other time, he was gone, melting back into the night, as if he were made of shadow. The next day, Maria packed a bag and went to stay with her sister. She put her house on the market and never spent another night there. She never found out who the man was or what he wanted. The lack of answers is what haunts her most. It wasn't a burglar or a typical criminal. It was something far more disturbing. A patient, silent hunter who found entertainment in methodically dismantling a person's sense of safety, one night at a time. Sometimes the threat outside doesn't use silence and fear. Sometimes it uses our own compassion as a weapon. Our second story comes from a man named David, a father of two, and it takes place on a dark and stormy night. A torrential downpour was lashing against the windows of David's home. It was after 11 p.m. His wife and kids were asleep upstairs, and he was dozing on the couch. He was jolted awake by a frantic, desperate knocking at his front door. His first thought was that it was an emergency. He rushed to the door, his heart pounding. Before unlocking it, he looked through the peephole. What he saw made his stomach clench. It was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her face, her tiny body shivering. Tears streamed down her cheeks. David's paternal instincts screamed at him to open the door and help her. He spoke through the door. "Hello? Are you okay?" The little girl's voice was small and panicked. "Please, sir," she cried. "Our car broke down up the road. My mommy is sick, and she sent me to get help. Our phone is dead." The story was plausible. The storm was terrible. It created a powerful moral dilemma for David. His mind raced. Leaving a child out in a storm was unthinkable, but opening his door this late at night to a stranger felt deeply wrong. He told her, "Okay, you stay right there. Don't move. I'm going to call 911 for you." "No," the girl shrieked, her voice suddenly sharp. "Mommy said not to call the police. She just needs help. Please, just let me in for a minute." That single word, "no," sent a jolt of ice through David's veins. It was too forceful, too demanding for a scared little girl. He pressed his eye back to the peephole, scrutinizing her, and that's when he saw it. The girl was crying, but her eyes weren't looking at the door. They were darting to the side, towards the edge of his porch, just out of the peephole's view. She was looking at someone else, taking direction. His blood ran cold. This wasn't a child in need. This was a trap, his voice now firm. David yelled through the door, "I'm on the phone with the police right now. They're on their way." The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The little girl's desperate crying stopped immediately. Her face went utterly blank. The terror and sadness vanished, replaced by a cold, empty expression. She gave the door one last flat look, then turned around. She didn't run. She walked calmly off the porch, down the driveway, and towards a large, dark van parked just up the street. A van that had been perfectly positioned in the blind spot from his living room windows. The side door of the van slid open. A dark figure pulled her inside, and it drove away into the storm without its headlights on. David stood there, shaking, realizing he had come within seconds of opening his door, not to a lost child, but to a team of home invaders using a child as bait. The horror of that night wasn't the storm outside, but the calculated evil that had knocked on his door, disguised as innocence. Our final story comes from a couple, Mark and Sarah, who moved to a remote house in the Appalachian Mountains. Their property backed up directly onto a vast, dense national forest. They loved the isolation, the silence, the feeling of being surrounded by nature. But they would soon learn that the woods have a silence all their own. And sometimes, they use that silence to listen. One moonless night, they were in bed, fast asleep. Around 2 a.m., Mark was woken by a sound from outside. It was a voice, and it was Sarah's voice. Clear as day, he heard his wife call his name from the backyard. "Mark, help me. I'm out here." His mind, thick with sleep, was instantly confused. He turned his head. Sarah was lying right next to him, sound asleep, breathing softly. He shook her shoulder gently. "Sarah, wake up." She mumbled, groggy. "What is it?" "I think I just heard you calling for me, from outside." Sarah was now wide awake, her face pale with fear. "What? No, I've been right here." And then they both heard it. "Mark, please, I'm hurt. Help me." It was Sarah's voice, the exact pitch, the exact cadence. It sounded like she was in distress, somewhere near the edge of the tree line. It was a perfect mimicry, a lure. They crept to their bedroom window, which overlooked the backyard. The yard was bathed in an eerie, dim starlight. They scanned the darkness, their hearts pounding. There, at the edge of the forest, they saw a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall and thin. Its limbs were too long, its body too slender to be human. It was pale, almost white in the darkness. It had no discernible features, just a vaguely humanoid shape. And as they watched, paralyzed with terror, Sarah's voice came from it again, a desperate, pleading cry for help. They knew they were looking at the source, a thing from the deep woods, a predator that had learned to copy the voice of its prey's mate to draw them out into the dark. As if sensing their eyes on it, the figure slowly tilted its head, an impossible, bird-like crack echoing in the silence. The pleading stopped, and then a new voice came from the figure, a voice that made the blood freeze in Mark's veins. It was his own voice, a perfect copy of his own voice, whispering from the pale figure in the dark. "Sarah," it whispered, "let me in." They stumbled back from the window. A shared scream caught in their throats. They barricaded their bedroom door and huddled together, listening as the mimicry continued for nearly an hour, calling for them in their own voices, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. Then, as suddenly as it began, it fell silent. They stayed in that room until the sun came up. In the morning, there was no sign of anything in the yard. No tracks, no trace, just the deep, dark woods. watching them in silence. They sold the house 6 months later. They learned that some places have voices of their own, and you should never, ever answer when they call your name. The watcher on the lawn, the child at the door, the voice in the woods. 3 true stories about the terrifying moment the outside world tries to get in. They remind us that our homes are only as safe as the locks on our doors and the trust we place in what we see and hear. They prove that the most terrifying phrase in any language isn't, "I'm going to get you." It's the quiet, unexpected sound that makes you turn to a locked door and whisper, "There's someone outside." What's the scariest someone's outside moment you've ever experienced? Share your true story in the comments below. And if these explorations into real-life horror resonate with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, making sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the darkness. Thank you for watching.